There'll be no more kneeling, no more bowing, no more kneeling after a while, no more weeping, no more crying, no more weeping after a while. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to be my Lord, and to go home to be with my Lord and be free.
I think we have reconvened. We're going to move from a consideration of slavery in the West Indies and the Caribbean and the colonial mainland to what you might consider the political economy of slavery. One thing I didn't say in my remarks, I did not stress how the history and the politics are intertwined. That is to say, you can't understand the politics of the United States in the era before the Civil War without paying due attention to this issue of slavery and slavery in the territories. I'm going to turn this over now to our moderator for today, Chris Parker, a professor of political science here at UCSB, and the commentator is Chris McCauley, a professor of political science at UCSB. I'm sorry, a professor of black studies at UCSB. Chris McCauley is is one of the political scientists in black studies, thus the faux pas.
Thank you, Professor Daniels. My name is Christopher Parker. Once again, I'm in the Department of Political Science here at UC Santa Barbara. Welcome this afternoon to our panel on slavery and development. We have three eminent scholars in that area. The first of which is Professor Joseph Unequal from University of Rochester. Professor Joseph Unequal is an historian at the University of Rochester. He has chaired the history department at if I mispronounce this, Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria. His publications include Africans and the Industrial Revolution in England, a study in international trade and economic development, and forced migration, the impact of export slave trade on African societies. He will lead off with his paper on the Atlantic world slave economy and the development process in England, 1650 to 1850. Next will be Professor Paul Finkelman of the University of Tulsa College of Law. Professor Finkelman is the Chapman Distinguished Professor at the University of Tulsa College of Law. He has written a number of publications on slavery and the law, including Slavery and the Founders, Race and Liberty in the Age of Jefferson, and The Age of Jim Crow, Segregation in the South from the End of Reconstruction to the Great Depression. Professor Finkelman's paper is on affirmative action in the master class, or for the master class rather, Understanding the Proslavery Constitution and its Impact on American Politics. Last but certainly, to use this colloquial, not least, is Professor David Horn of Cal State Northridge right down the road. Professor David Horn is on the graduate faculty of the program in Public Administration, Cal State University, Northridge. He is editor of the Journal of African Studies and the Journal of Pan-African Studies. His publications include The State of the Race, a 21st Century Analysis of Black Americans. His paper is entitled Profits from Slave Breeding in America. And without further ado, please welcome Professor Unequal.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, particularly Professor Daniels, for bringing me to the West Coast at this time of the year. In Rochester, where we've had the hottest April in history of the area, and we've also had the coldest April. Those two combinations can tell you the kind of weather we have in Rochester. So I'm really very glad to be here at this time of the year, and more than that, I'm very glad to be part of these eminent scholars pursuing a very important subject. For purposes of efficiency, I usually like talking to my paper, but for purposes of efficiency, I'm going to read the paper that I have in order to be able to get some of the arguments across within the limited time that I have. As you've already been told, I'm looking at the role of the slave-based Atlantic world economy in the development process in England for a period of 200 years from 1650 to 1850. Between 1650 and 1850, England's economy and society underwent a radical transformation both in scale and structure, in a manner the first of its kind in human history. This unprecedented socioeconomic transformation is captured by changes in the demographic and economic structure of England over the 200-year period. This may be illustrated. In 1651, there were only 5.2 million people in England who, like the rest of the world, derived much of their income from agriculture and lived in the rural areas. As late as 1700, only 17% of the population lived in urban areas, and 61.2% of the male employment was in agriculture. But by 1840, the urban population was 48.3%, and only 28.6% of the male employment was in agriculture, with 47.3% in industry. In 1851, the total population stood at 16.7 million, more than 3 times the size of the 1651 population, by which time England had a full-blown industrial economy and society and had become the workshop of the world. The first country in the whole world to achieve full industrialization with manufacturing mechanized and organized in large-scale factory system. This great transformation, to use Karl Polanyi's expression, is explained in the mainstream literature in terms of internal forces in England: agricultural improvement, population growth, chance endowment of coal and iron ore, progressive social structure, and/or accidental development of technology, with no serious examination of the contribution of African peoples. Over half a century ago, Eric Williams had attempted to show the contribution of Africans on the basis of profits from the slave trade and slavery, and the employment of those profits to finance England's industrialization process. This well-known Eric Williams thesis has been attacked repeatedly since it first appeared in 1944. I have shown elsewhere that the British slave trade was more profitable than the critics of Eric Williams would want us to believe, but argued at the same time that the emphasis on profits is misplaced. I believe the contribution of Africans to the transformation of England's economy and society between 1650 and 1850 would best be demonstrated in terms of the role of the slave-based Atlantic world economy in the transformation process. This paper presents a summary of my attempt to date in this direction. The logical structure of the argument may be briefly stated. The analysis centers on the economics of international trade during the transformation process. It is argued that the growth of England's international trade during the period was a critical factor in the process, and that the evolution of the Atlantic world economic system with its expanding multilateral trading network was at the center of this enlarged international trade. The analysis begins, therefore, with tracing the development of the Atlantic trading network, estimating its growing volume and value over time, and assessing the contribution of diasporic Africans in the Americas and those of the African continent. Following this, England's transformation trajectory is outlined and fitted into England's quantitative and qualitative operation in the Atlantic world trading system, and the relative weight of the Atlantic world slave economy is determined in several ways. Important in the exercise is a comparative regional analysis of the development of England's major regions over the period, which helps to bring out in sharp relief the central factors in the process. I use the terms Atlantic world and Atlantic basin interchangeably to define a geographical area that includes Western Europe, comprising Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, Switzerland, Austria, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Britain, and Ireland. Western Africa, from Mauritania in the northwest to Namibia in the southwest, comprising the two modern regions of West Africa and West Central Africa. And the Americas, comprising all the countries of modern Latin America and the Caribbean, the United States of America, and Canada. Before the middle decades of the 15th century, these three broad regions of the Atlantic basin operated in isolation one from another, although there were indirect trade relations between Western Europe and Western Africa through the merchants of the Middle East and North Africa. The Atlantic Ocean was then a relatively quiet sea, the Mediterranean being the main center of waterborne international trade in the whole world at the time. Also, at this time, the Atlantic basin economies were all pre-industrial and pre-capitalist. The vast majority of the populations on both sides of the Atlantic, east and west, were engaged in subsistence agricultural production, the bulk of the output being consumed directly by the producers without reaching the market. Elaborate craft production, which was largely part of agriculture, also existed in the regions, making it possible for the basic needs of the people to be internally met in the main. A major factor constraining economic development in large areas of the Atlantic world in the 15th century was limited opportunity to trade. Even in Western Europe, where trade had grown most considerably, trading opportunities had become increasingly limited by the 16th century. The movement of West Europeans into the Atlantic, where commodity production offered immense opportunities for trade expansion, was initially triggered by the diminishing extent of the market accessible to the West European traders and producers. Ultimately, these West European economic and political entrepreneurs were not disappointed. From the middle to the last decades of the 15th century, the Portuguese explored and established trading posts on the western coast of Africa, trading mainly gold but also establishing slave-worked plantations and producing sugar on islands off the African coast. Then came the jewel of West European expansion, the exploration and colonization of the Americas from 1492. The subsequent integration of Western Europe, Western Africa, and the Americas in a single trading system, the Atlantic World Trading System, considerably extended the production and consumption possibility frontier of the societies in the Atlantic Basin through the widening of the range of resources and products it made available. But there was a problem. Given the rudimentary transportation technology of the time, unit cost of production in the Americas had to be sufficiently low for American products to bear the cost of transatlantic transportation and still secure a large market. This meant large-scale production requiring far more workers than family labor. Yet, no market for legally free labor in any region of the Atlantic or anywhere else could provide such labor in the quantities and at the prices required at the time. For one thing, population to land ratios and the development of division of labor had not yet reached levels in Europe and Africa that could give rise to a large population of landless people forced into conditions that will encourage them to migrate voluntarily in large numbers to the Americas. On the other hand, because land was abundant in the Americas, legally free migrants from the Old World were unwilling to work for others. Rather, they took up land to produce on a small scale for themselves, usually subsistence production in the main. The widespread destruction of the Native American population resulting from European colonization worsened the problem as it further increased land labor ratios in the Americas. With less than 500,000 Europeans in all of the Americas between 1646 and 1665, the destruction of the Indian populations meant that average population density in the Americas was less than 1 person per square mile in the 17th century. Consequently, large-scale production in the Americas depended largely on coerced labor for several centuries. Initially, the indigenous peoples of the Americas were forced to provide such labor. For silver mining and the provisioning of the European colonists, coerced Indian labor was relatively successful in Spanish America. But it was unsuitable in most other areas of production. As the Indian population declined, the production of commodities in the Americas for Atlantic commerce came to rest almost entirely on the shoulders of forced migrants from Africa. Subsisting partly on the provisions from the small plots they stretched themselves to work in their leisure time, their labor cost to the slaveholders was below subsistence costs. Hence, because of the cheapness of their labor and the scale of production they made possible, prices of the American commodities fell sharply over time in Europe. Products such as tobacco and sugar moved from being luxuries for the rich to everyday consumption goods for the masses in rural and urban areas. The falling prices of raw materials such as cotton and dyestuffs contributed greatly to the development of industries producing for mass consumer markets. It is thus no surprise that commodity production in the Americas for Atlantic commerce expanded phenomenally between 1501 and 1850, increasing from an annual average of 1.3 million pounds sterling in 1501 to 1550 to 89.2 million pounds in 1848 to 1850. The estimated share of these commodities produced by diasporic Africans in the Americas ranges from 54% in 1501 to 1550 to 80% in 1781 to 1800. Based largely on the American commodities, the annual value of multilateral Atlantic commerce grew equally explosively during the same period, from 3.2 million pounds sterling in 1501 to 1550 to 231 million pounds in 1848 to 1850. Because the imperial nations of Western Europe integrated their American colonies into their mercantilist arrangement, the American product by law had to go to the respective European mother countries, Spain, Portugal, England, France, and Holland, through which other European countries received them as re-exports. European products from non-mother countries going to the American colonies also had to go through the same mother countries as re-exports. In this way, through direct and indirect stimulation, intra-European trade expanded at rates that were a multiple of the rate of growth of Atlantic commerce itself. And the Americas became a major factor in the commercialization of socioeconomic life in Western Europe between 1500 and 1800. As one writer has noted, quote, because much of the increase in trade within Europe was related to overseas colonies and markets, it is difficult to separate long-distance and intra-European trade, unquote. Between 1650 and 1850, England's international trade was the main beneficiary of the expanding multilateral Atlantic commerce and intra-European trade. Two major factors were responsible for this. One was England's naval power, which enabled the country to protect and expand its American territories at the expense of other European powers, especially France and Holland, and secure advantageous treaties with Portugal and Spain, treaties that particularly linked English trade to the dynamic forces emanating from Portuguese Brazil and Spanish America. The other is the unique role of British America, especially New England and the Middle Atlantic territories, in the network of trade which developed over time among the colonies of the New World. On this point, my analysis of the evidence has led me to the following conclusion, quote, these developments in northern mainland British America, dependent on trading opportunities provided by the plantation and mining economies of the Americas as they did, created an important development zone with the capacity to suck incomes from the plantation and mining zones, and with social structures and income distribution pattern which gave rise to mass consumption of manufactured goods. Because of colonial arrangements and cultural attachment, the incomes gathered in the hands of producers and consumers in northern mainland British America were spent on imports from Britain. This was a unique phenomenon in the Atlantic basin. No other European power was similarly situated during the period, unquote. The course and character of socioeconomic change and industrialization in England between 1650 and 1850 show clearly the importance of the developments in the Atlantic world already outlined. For several centuries preceding the 17th century, the wool trade with Northwest Europe and population growth had been the central factors in the process of change in England's economy and society, especially in the southern counties. Commercialization of agriculture and development of woolen textile manufacturing as import substitution industry with its main market in northern and northwest Europe were the major accomplishments of this early process. The development of political institutions, particularly the evolution of effective parliamentary system of government, were also important achievements. By the mid-17th century, Although the growth of the woolen industry had significantly reduced England's dependence on Northwest Europe for manufactures, the economy still lagged behind the major centers of manufacturing in the Low Country and the German states. From the late 17th century, the woolen industry faced difficulties at home and in North and Northwest Europe. Exports to the latter stagnated as the states there developed their own industries, while growing imports of Oriental cottons and silks encroached on the industry's domestic market in England. What is more, England's population had moved back and forth since the subsistence crisis of the 14th century, unable to break through the 6 million ceiling imposed by available resources. From the Restoration to the early decades of the 18th century, major changes in economy and society came from agricultural improvement, leading to significant export surpluses in the first half of the 18th century, and the growth of service incomes connected with entrepot trade. The additional foreign exchange accruing from the agricultural export surplus and from the export of services in the entrepot trade helped to pay for imported manufactures, which expanded the domestic market for manufactured goods and created the necessary conditions for import substitution industrialization on a broad front in the early decades of the 18th century. Thus, the early years of the industrialization process in 18th century England centered on efforts by English entrepreneurs to develop local industries aimed at capturing the domestic market for manufactures created largely by the developments of the decades 1650 to 1740. How many minutes do I have? 5? Okay. I think the best thing I would like to do with the remaining 5 minutes is simply summarize much of the argument. Much of what I have left to talk about in the argument is simply to say here that from the late 17th century, industrialization in England developed on the basis of import substitution. But very quickly, the domestic market, which existed as of the early 18th century, was saturated, and therefore, thereafter, these manufacturers had to struggle looking for overseas markets. Just as the more recent import substitution industrializations in the non-Western world developed. But the problem here is that Northern and Northwest Europe, that had remained the main market for the woolen textile industry in England for decades, had begun to shrink. Because these territories were developing their own industries and were therefore no longer willing to accept manufactures from England. For which reason, the English manufacturers could only find new markets in the Atlantic world. And therefore, from the 18th century on, much of the expansion of overseas markets for these new industries could only be found in the Atlantic markets. Now, because of this reorientation of England's overseas trade during this period, the earlier regions in the south that had benefited from manufacturing as well as agriculture, but found much of their markets in northern and northwestern Europe, places like East Anglia, places like the West Country, these two areas that had been in the forefront of agricultural and manufacturing development began to decline, began to stagnate because they were facing export markets that were not expanding. The new markets in the Atlantic, these new markets were captured by new regions. And which were these new regions? These were the Lancashire region, the West Riding of Yorkshire, as well as the West Midlands. These were the regions that captured the Atlantic markets. And because they succeeded in capturing the Atlantic markets, these regions that had remained very backward up to where the 18th century were the regions where ultimately the Industrial Revolution occurred. And these earlier regions in the south, the southern counties, where manufacturing and agricultural development had progressed far more rapidly earlier on, stagnated. For which reason, even population growth that occurred from 1750 to the 19th century, much of that population growth tended to take place in these northern counties and the West Midlands. And much of the new technologies that developed and much of the factory system that developed did not develop in the earlier, more progressive southern counties, but they developed in these northern counties and the West Midlands that had access to Atlantic commerce. And therefore, looking at the evidence this way, much of the older argument linking the Industrial Revolution to agriculture, to population, to progressive social structures, such arguments really don't have any real foundation in evidence, because these agricultural developments, these progressive social structures that developed earlier, they all took place in the South. And it was not in the South that the Industrial Revolution occurred. It was in the North that had been agriculturally backward, with some even feudal relics in the social structure. It was in the North that all of that took place. And they developed those structures, they developed the technology without depending on the southern agricultural counties for their markets, nor for their labor. Their labor was internally generated. Their exports went predominantly to the Atlantic markets. In fact, up to 70% of the total output in Lancashire, in the West Riding of Yorkshire, up to 70% of their total output was exported to the Atlantic markets. And it was in these fast-growing regions, dependent on the Atlantic markets, that succeeded in developing the new technologies. And again, this is the basis of my own argument that the mainstream literature that talks about the technological development being accidental, and that is what the literature says, that the technology developed accidentally. My argument is that the correlation between expanding markets in the North and rapid technological development, and the correlation between technological stagnation and stagnant expansion in the South, these two correlations, these two sets of correlations are just too strong to be accidental. And therefore, I make the point that technological development in the Industrial Revolution was related to market expansion and market size. And much of that market expansion and market size could be found in the Atlantic basin. I would want to stop there in order not to take the time of other members. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Inekori. Next, Professor Paul Finkelman.
Sorry about that. Oh, it's okay. It's okay.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank Douglas for putting together such a spectacular program. And since we haven't done so yet, I think all of us should give him a round of applause for what he's done for us. It's always fun to be able to embarrass your friends in public. The U.S. Constitution was written in 1787 at a convention in Philadelphia, attended by delegates from 12 states. A number of them were slave owners, and many who were not slave owners had been slave owners at some time in their life. They wrote a constitution to create a more perfect union, to create a federal system, and to accommodate the political and economic needs of the various states that made up the United States. Reflecting on that Constitution in the 1830s, William Lloyd Garrison, the great abolitionist, referred to the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement in hell. Garrison refused to vote or participate in politics because to do so he would have to sanction the pro-slavery, war-sanctioning Constitution of the United States. And thus, in a bit of irony, Garrison consistently argued for disunion, suggesting that the free states withdraw from the United States, secede, and create a free republic. Was Garrison right? And if so, why, and how did this Constitution get to be created? What I would like to argue in this afternoon is that, in fact, Garrison was absolutely right, that the Constitution was pro-slavery, and that, in fact, the Constitution can be seen as an affirmative action program for the slaveholding classes of the United States. And as we approach issues of both affirmative action and reparations, we must begin by understanding that the United States was from the beginning a slaveholders' republic, that in 1776, when the revolution took place, every one of the new independent states was a slaveholding state. By 1787, when the Constitutional Convention met, two of the states, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, had ended slavery outright, and three more, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island, were in the process of ending slavery through a very creative program known as gradual abolition, which was designed to end slavery relatively quickly with as least social friction as possible. However, the majority of the states remain slave states, and although we think of the North as being free and the South as being a slave-centered society, New Jersey and New York had substantial numbers of slaves, and no one at the time of the convention expected New Jersey or New York to end slavery anytime soon. And in fact, during the ratification debates, James Madison consistently pointed to New York and New Jersey as a place where the South would find allies because, he said, they still had slavery. Thus, it should not surprise us that the Constitution was pro-slavery, and this is the important point to begin with. We shouldn't come as a big shock to Americans that slavery is protected, because slavery is, after real estate, the second most valuable form of privately held property in the United States in 1787. That is, the total cash value, if you were to sell them, of all the slaves in the United States exceeded the value of all of the businesses or all of the horses or all of the cows. Only real estate was more valuable. But unlike any other form of privately held property, slavery was unique, it was bizarre, it was, as Southerners would later call it themselves, a peculiar institution, an institution requiring special kinds of protections, special affirmative protections, if you will, for the slaveholding class. When Charles Cotesworth Pinckney returned to the South Carolina legislature after the convention, he urged ratification of the Constitution because, he said, it protected their most important interests. We have a security that the general government can never emancipate them, for no such authority is granted, and it is admitted on all hands that the general government has no powers but what are expressly granted by the Constitution, and that all rights not expressly granted were reserved for the states. Concluding his speech, Pinckney bragged, "In short, considering all circumstances, we have made the best security for this species of property it was in our power to make. We would have made better if we could, but on the whole, I do not think them bad." And indeed, Pinckney could turn to the Constitution and point to numerous places where slavery was protected. Obviously, the representation scheme, which counted slaves into the population for the purposes of representation in Congress, gave the South extra muscle in the House of Representatives. The slave trade provision, which prevented the Congress from ending the slave trade before the year 1808, was, of course, a great victory for South Carolina. I should note in passing, by the way, I was advertised as a law professor, but of course I am a PhD in history, and for many years taught U.S. survey, which was always my favorite course. And whenever I had to choose which survey text to use, I had a very easy first step. I would see what they said about the slave trade to see if they got it right. Unfortunately, sometimes I would have to eliminate all the survey textbooks. But the slave trade clause did not require that the slave trade be ended in 1808. It simply prohibited the ending of the slave trade before 1808. This is something that history professors and law professors, everybody gets wrong because nobody wants to read the language. So it's very important to understand that what they were not doing was saying, in 1808 we will end the African slave trade. Rather, they were saying before 1808 there can be no touching of the African slave trade. Now, this is crucial because everyone at the Constitutional Convention, except one delegate from Pennsylvania, believes that the Deep South is growing faster than the rest of the country. If you accept their assumption that South Carolina and Georgia are growing faster than the rest of the country, and that Mississippi and Alabama will become states before Ohio, say, became a state, then what we would expect is that by 1808, the Deep South would have enough political power in the House of Representatives to prevent an abolition of the African slave trade. So what South Carolina is doing is buying 20 years of time to gain the political muscle necessary to keep the slave trade forever, or as long as South Carolina wants it. Furthermore, to put into this matrix, we have to understand that in order to end the slave trade, you had to carry both the House, the Senate, and the presidency, because you had to pass the bill in both houses of Congress and have the president sign it. So the Deep South is counting that in 1808, they'll control something. They'll control the presidency, the Senate, the House. Maybe they'll simply control the committee in the House of Representatives that bottles up the slave trade bill. So the notion that the framers expected to end the slave trade in 1808 is an extremely pleasant and comforting myth. Unfortunately, it's a myth for which there is some reality, but not a great deal. I should also add, however, to the credit of many of the framers, that after the convention, when campaigning for ratification, many of the framers used this 1808 cutoff and said, in 1808 we will have to end the slave trade, the Constitution mandates it. And in fact, by perpetuating this myth for 20 years, by 1808, many Americans actually thought they did have to end it in 1808, and so it ultimately was ended. But if South Carolina had won out, it would not have been. In addition to the slave trade provision, there was the fugitive slave provision, which allowed, of course, for the return of runaway slaves. There was the protection, which most people miss when they read the Constitution. Twice in the Constitution, the national government promises to suppress rebellions and insurrections. Now, of course, there are many kinds of rebellions and insurrection. There was Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. There would be the Whisker Rebellion. There would, of course, be that little rebellion that took place in 1861 to 1865. But for Southerners, insurrections meant only one thing. And in fact, when the Southern delegates came back from the convention, they were pleased to tell their constituents that the national government was going to go send its army down to suppress slave rebellions. And of course, during Nat Turner's rebellion, the U.S. Navy and various U.S. Army groups came down to help suppress the rebellion. And of course, it was an Army colonel, a fellow named Bobby Lee, and a group of U.S. Marines who suppressed John Brown's insurrection in 1859. So in fact, the insurrection clause plays directly into the hands of the slaveholding classes. Finally, finally one more, is the Electoral College. Now, we don't think of the Electoral College as being pro-slavery. We think of the Electoral College as merely being some weird concept that allows the guy who won all the votes, or the majority of the votes, not to be elected president every once in a while. But where did this Electoral College come from? At the Constitutional Convention, there is some discussion of actually letting the people elect the president. James Madison says in a speech that the people are the most fit. He says they're the fittest to elect the president. But then he says, but there's one problem with that. If the people elect our president, Madison says, our Negroes won't count. And of course, what he means by that is that the population of the South has a huge component of slaves. Virginia is about 40% slave. South Carolina is close to 50% slave. North Carolina is probably 30% slave at this time. And so if it's simply a straight out popular vote, The North is going to overwhelm the South in presidential elections because the North will have more voters, because after all, slaves can't vote. But if you create the Electoral College, which is based on congressional representation, and as we know, congressional representation is based on the 3/5 clause, where you count every 5 slaves as 3 more people solely for purposes of representation, then what you do is you give the South extra muscle in the Electoral College to elect presidents. Consider the election of 1800 between a man who had never owned a slave and who despised slavery, and a man from Virginia who owned approximately 200 human beings, including some of his own relatives, by marriage and by birth. And that, of course, was Thomas Jefferson. Now, when we read our U.S. survey textbooks, we always see this as one of the closest elections in history, and the standard rap is that Adams loses because the American people were so fed up with the Sedition Act of 1798 that Adams had to lose. Well, that may be true, but at the same time, if we were to withdraw from Thomas Jefferson all of the electoral votes created by slaves, by counting slaves, and we did the same for Adams because Adams picks up a few Southern electors. If we were to withdraw this, guess what? Thomas Jefferson doesn't get elected president in 1800. John Adams gets reelected. Now, how does this affect American history? Well, to hearken back to the earlier papers at the very beginning of this conference, in 1800, John Adams is on the verge of recognizing Haiti, giving diplomatic relations to Haiti, and welcoming Haiti into the fold of the new revolutionary republics of the New World. The Haitians, by the way, who have no tradition of self-government because they were slaves, are looking to the United States for leadership. Toussaint Louverture sees himself as the George Washington of Haiti, and that's a high compliment to the Americans. He wants the Americans to help him. Also, of course, by 1800, the United States is Haiti's biggest trading partner. If Adams had been elected president, we would undoubtedly have recognized Haiti in 1800 or 1801 or 1802, and the whole history of Haiti might have been one of cooperation between the United States and this new republic, which needed our help and which could have benefited from our help, and in turn we could have benefited from trade with Haiti. Instead, Jefferson comes in, he withdraws the American envoys, and he basically embargoes trade with Haiti 3 years before his general embargo against Europe during the Napoleonic Wars. Jefferson's son-in-law, who is noted for being a parsimonious congressman from Virginia, his son-in-law says on the floor of the House of Representatives that he is willing to spend the United States into bankruptcy to destroy the Black Republic. This is what Jeffersonian democracy brings to inter-American relations in 1801 when Jefferson becomes president. Had the 3/5 clause not been folded into the Electoral College, this would not have been the case. Similarly, had the 3/5 clause not been folded into congressional representation, when crucial votes on slavery took place, such as the Missouri Compromise, which only passed by 6 votes in the House of Representatives, that vote would not have passed because there would not have been enough Southerners to get it through. Similarly, the Compromise of 1850, the draconian fugitive slave law of 1850, might not have been passed were it not for the extra delegates in Congress that the South gets through the 3/5 clause. Now, I have no doubt that the way politics works, something would have been passed during the Missouri debates. Something would have been passed in 1850. But if we imagine having this with a Southern delegations that are short 30 or so members of the House of Representatives in the 1820s and more than that in the 1850s, we would imagine a South that is politically much weaker, politically much less able to demand things, much less able to control the Democratic Party as it does from the 1820s until the Civil War. And if that were the case, the whole tenor of American politics would have changed. During the debate over representation, William Patterson of New Jersey complained about the notion that you would count slaves for purposes of representation. He says slaves are no light but as property. They're not free agents. They have no personal liberty, no faculty of acquiring property, but on the contrary are themselves property, and like other property entirely at the will of the master. Patterson asked, has a man in Virginia a number of votes in proportion to his number of slaves? Why should they be represented in the general government, he asked. Now, it is worth noting that there is another myth that's sometimes perpetuated about the 3/5 clause, that it declares that black people are 3/5 of a person. It does not. The 3/5 clause is not about race, it is about status. And in fact, when slaves become free people, they are counted fully for purposes of representation. So that when the northern states finish ending slavery, their population goes up in terms of representation. Similarly, there's an irony to this. At the end of the Civil War, the South discovers it has more representatives in Congress than it had before the Civil War, because now the former slaves are all counted fully for purposes of representation. So it's not about race, it is about status, and it is about the notion that people who are not considered people for any other purposes suddenly are counted in some way to give the South more political power. At the convention, Gouverneur Morris complains that he is reduced to the dilemma of doing injustice to the southern states or injustice to human nature. And he says he would prefer to do injustice to the southern states. And so the debates over slavery are real throughout the convention. And throughout the convention, there are moral cries from a few of the delegates. Gouverneur Morris says that the slave trade provision, which allows the continuation of the trade, combined with the 3/5 clause, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina who goes to the coast of Africa and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity tears away his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondages, he shall have more votes in a government instituted for the protection of the rights of mankind than a citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. But of course, Morris is a minority in these debates. And more common are the debates, the positions of people like Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, who says that he would not debate the morality or wisdom of slavery, simply asserting that what enriches a part enriches the whole. And so if South Carolina gets richer because of the slave trade, then Connecticut becomes richer. And Ellsworth goes on to say that he's never owned a slave, so he cannot declare one way or the other what the effect of the slavery would be on the morality of people, because he doesn't know anything about slavery. Now, thus we have compromises over slavery to perpetuate the slave trade, to represent slavery in the national government. And as Pinckney says to his constituents in South Carolina, we have obtained a right to recover our slaves in whatever part of America they may take refuge, for it is a right we had not had before. And so, in the end, we get a convention that creates a constitution that is fundamentally and really completely pro-slavery. On the first day of serious debate at the convention, slavery comes up. And on the last day, when Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts refuses to sign the Constitution, he says one of the reasons is because of the slave trade provision. Slavery is there throughout the convention, as it properly should be, because as what this conference shows, and in fact what I think the American people do not yet fully understand, is that slavery is the central experience of United States history from the beginning of the United States until the end of the Civil War, and that slavery is central to everything that happens in American politics. I don't want to go into a great law school lecture here and give you sort of boring constitutional law decisions, but I want to give you a sense of how important this is, because there are a number of constitutional law doctrines that we live with today, and there are a number of recent decisions that this U.S. Supreme Court has made which bear on the relationship between slavery then, constitutional law then, and constitutional law now. The whole notion of states' rights, of state sovereignty, of the need of the states to regulate their local institutions, comes out of the need of the South to be able to regulate slavery as it wishes. In constitutional law, there is a notion of state police powers, which means that the states can regulate things that might otherwise be regulated by Congress under the Commerce Clause. That comes out of 1830s arguments about the need of the South to be able to regulate slavery. Similarly, there are arguments about the inability of the national government to tell state officials how to act that come out of slave cases. These have direct application today. The Supreme Court recently, in the last few years, struck down a portion of the Violence Against Women Act on the grounds that the federal government had no business allowing for private lawsuits or federal prosecutions for men who raped women. The analysis of that act comes right out of the pro-slavery doctrines of the Tawney Court about the separation of powers and about the separation of the states from the national government and the need of the states to have their local police powers. Similarly, a portion of the Brady Bill was struck down, which of course required that sheriffs register people and do background checks. That comes right out of Prigg versus Pennsylvania, which was a case upholding the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793. Laws regulating the construction on beachfront property and laws designed to protect environmentally sensitive lands have been struck down by the Rehnquist Court using doctrines that come right out of Dred Scott about the notion of property and the right of the government to interfere with the way people use their property. The law regulating the possession of guns in school zones was struck down on case law that comes right out of slavery. Now, I should add, by the way, if you read these cases, you will not find citations to Dred Scott or Prigg or the pro-slavery arguments, because unfortunately, Justice Scalia and Justice Rehnquist and Justice Thomas, most of all, do not have the honesty to say that their doctrines are coming right out of the ideas of Roger B. Tawney and John C. Calhoun. But the reality is we live to this day with a constitutional legacy of slavery and a pro-slavery constitution. I just want to end with one more thought. During the debate over the ratification of the Constitution, a group of anti-federalists in Massachusetts complained about the Constitution because they said it bound all the states together in a compact and it required that the northern states protect slavery. They said we would be under obligation reciprocally to aid each other in defense and support of everything to which they are entitled thereby, right or wrong. Thus, they might be forced to suppress a slave rebellion or in some other way defend slavery. And they said this lust for slavery was portentous of much evil in America, for the cry of innocent blood hath undoubtedly reached to the heavens, to which that cry is always directed, and will draw down upon them vengeance adequacy to the enormity of the crime. I would at least argue that some of the events of 1861 to 1865, the killing of more than 660,000 Americans in combat, was the beginning of the vengeance brought down for the enormity of the crime. I would further say that the task of America in the 21st century, however one feels about the nature of what a reparation might be, whether it is creation of economic enterprise zones in communities, whether it is the creation of serious financial aid to the most poor and disenfranchised in America so they can go to college, whether it is the creation of serious schooling in neighborhoods, or whether, as one student when I lectured at Thurgood Marshall Law School last week had on her t-shirt, "It's about the money." However one thinks about these notions, the place to begin this conversation is with the understanding that when we created a more perfect union, it was terribly and immorally far from perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Finkelman.
Okay, let's rock and roll.
I want to segue with Dr. Finkelman, who said, thank you for inviting us and allowing us to be able to provide some scholastic information and to be able to communicate with each other. And you can invite me anytime. Since you're at the beach, just invite me down. For over 200 years of record keeping and academic scholarship regarding slavery in America, one of the most persistently murky, least understood, and most consistently denied aspects of our peculiar institution was slave breeding in America. They did it, but they all want to say it wasn't me. Since the 17th century, when the Puritans came over in their migration and they brought the Percherons and their other pets, their other animals, this country has been fascinated with experimenting, breeding. I mean, they've practiced on quarter horses, on draft horses. That's how we got the thoroughbred. That's how a lot of you have your little Westies and your little Yorkies. You know, we practice on animals to be able to breed them. Given that started when we set up our colonial past, and given how Africans were treated regularly as beasts of burden, called animals, called all kinds of names. Now, what would stop people who already knew about breeding from continuing to practice breeding? Just a question. Hitler not only did the Jews, he did black people too. Whenever you get a chance to practice and there is very little response, you're going to do it. There is a very big conventional wisdom within the slave literature of all this time period. And most of that wisdom has said, like U.B. Phillips said, well, there may have been one or two white plantation owners or white farmers who didn't know any better. So yeah, they may have had a little breeding. You've had Fogel and Engelman. You've had a number of other major scholars say, oh no, that never occurred. What we did have was an obsession with, natural increase. We want to encourage you to have more children. That's a lie. What did occur, and I want you to know exactly where I am, then I'll show you how I got here. This is a preliminary paper. I don't have time to give you the full text of it. I'm doing an article and a full book. Here's where I am. Slave breeding did occur in America. It was a very historical fact. We can prove it. It was big. It was not some little accident. It occurred. Yes, like animals, like dogs, like cats, like thoroughbreds. We were bred. The African American population, as much as we claim our African ancestry, and that is an historical fact too, we were bred here. You all remember Kunta Kinte and Toby. You all remember that scene in Roots. America was telling you on the TV screen what they had already done. How do we get here? How do we get to that point? There are 5 basic preliminary questions that we can use to even get started. And again, I'm going to focus on only the first one. And then I'll tell you how it was profitable. Why are we doing this? Because the Hayden Colloquium that we are all here to talk about says that we have to have intellectual exchange. I do need to clarify, the Hayden Colloquium is not supposed to be a reparations debate. Tom Hayden said that his bill was not a reparations bill, nor was his slave insurance bill that is now on the front page of the LA Times, and you will get a lot more information about this tomorrow, it was not a reparations bill either. It was supposed to be legislation to get us at the truth. However, there are current reparations advocates who say clearly that the information that comes out, if it implicates the federal government, the state government, the county government, the local government, if it shows that corporations, if it shows that individuals have benefited unjustly from the unpaid labor, and reproduction is labor. That's why they call it labor. When you have unjustly benefited from unpaid labor, there will be a reckoning, so say the advocates. Now, part of that reckoning may be about slave breeding. That may be why most historians duck and dodge. They run as quickly as they can when you bring this up. It didn't happen. Yes, it did. Let me give you a little simple mathematical calculation. I need you to kind of stay with me for a minute. I'm going to give you a few numbers, not a lot of them. At the first level of analysis in terms of evidence, the claim about there having been slave breeding in American society is based on information that Phil Curtin presented back in '69 and Lovejoy presented back in 1982 and 1989, that Professor Joseph Unequal presented in 1994 and 1998, and that David Eltis is presenting now from the W.E.B. Du Bois database, the institute out of New York. What they all say is that approximately 12 to 15 million Africans were exported between 1450 and 1867. Now, out of that exportation, it accounted for over 2 million Africans being exported between 1600 and 1700. It accounted for about 6.5 million Africans exported between 1700 and 1800, and it accounted for 3.5 million, a decline between 1800 and 1880. In other words, this meant that slave exports through the 17th century peaked during the 18th century and then declined again after the cotton gin, the cotton engine, had been invented. So less Africans were coming out of the continent, not more. Same time, slavery imposed on African Americans as a group officially began in the 1660s in this country. Forget 1619, we were not slaves then. Forget all the other crap that they've told you, that did not occur. In terms of a group of people, you are the slaves because you look like a slave because you're black. That began Maryland, Virginia, 1660s. Between 1660 and 1750, you had about 200,000 African American slaves here. By 1790, the first time that we had a U.S. census, that had gone up to 600,000. That was a 300% increase. Now, between 1790 and 1850, we had over 4,780,000 slaves in this society. At the same time, the African exports have gone down. We have gone up to 4,780,000, an 1,100% increase. Now, by the time we got to the 1880s, 1890s, in fact, year 1900, when you include all blacks now, free blacks, former slave blacks, we gotten up to 7,800,000. Now, what most of the historians say is that, well, we had the domestic slave trade, we had the internal slave trade, okay, and then that accounted for most of the increase. Black people, they love to have sex. All they want to do is be promiscuous and dance, and that'll keep them happy. So what you had was this big fertility going on because we finally let them be with each other. Again, that's what the historians say, and they're lying. What we are talking about is looking at that big increase. Dr. Finkelman talked about the 1808 Act that was supposed to have ended, the slave trade. We all know it did not. We all know there was an illegal slave trade going on. But that illegal slave trade, which most of the historians say accounted for most of the increase, could not have done that. It could not have done that because there were penalties involved. Yeah, they did not put a lot of people in jail. Just like today, they put us in jail and not a lot of other people. Okay, there's what we call lax enforcement or selective enforcement. So the illegal slave trade did occur. It did continue, but that is not where the increase came from. In fact, it was impossible for the increase to have come from there. Not only did you have, as part of the Confederate Constitution in 1861, that it was illegal to import Africans from any place else, you already had the 1808 Act. The majority of the increase must have come from slaves reproducing themselves because they were forced to. That's the only thing that you end up with. But let's just say, well, the numbers don't really tell you that. Maybe, Dr. Horn, you're just trying to interpret things the way you want. You already know where you want to go. You're simply going to manipulate the information to get there. After all, I have been trained at UCLA, and so we know how to do that. But let's talk about people who did know. Let's talk about what the slaves said. You all remember the WPA. You all remember that 1930 study in which people went out and interviewed a number of people who were former slaves, okay? Now, in most of the history books, they want to talk about 2 or 3. That's about all you're going to get. Well, there were a lot more than 2 or 3. And they say it point blank. Mr. Covey was a poor man. He was just commencing in his life. He was only able to buy 1 slave. He bought her, as he said, for a breeder. She was a big, able-bodied woman, about 20 years old. She had already given birth to 1 child, which proved to be just what he wanted. So after buying her, he hired him another man to come in and to live with her, and he got rich. My master would only raise the healthy, and excuse me, all of you, but I'm reading from the quotes, healthy nigger families, and used us strong, healthy young bucks to stand the healthy nigger gals. Now, when I was just a young man, they took care not to strain me because I was a handsome young pup, and I was in demand for breeding all the time. Well, my master, old Mr. Pinchback, well, he bred niggas as quick as he could because they were all money for him. I mean, no one had any say about who they could be with. The nigger husbands wasn't the only ones that were doing that either. You had the masters and the white overseers would take all the nigger gals anytime they wanted. So I've not only seen a bunch of black and brown ones, I've seen a bunch of white ones too. When the master saw a good big nigger, sometimes he'd buy that boy for a breeder. My daddy was one like that. Well, the master, he'd be hiring some more women always to come and see me. He wouldn't let me have just 1 woman. I had about 15, and I don't know how many children, over 100, I think. Well, my grandfather on my father's side was used as a stock Negro. He was over 6'4", and he fathered 56 children. He was known as the giant breeder on the plantation. There are many more like that. My aunt was a breeder. She's a woman that had children once every 12 months, just like a cow bringing in a calf. Her master loved her. Let's talk about what the plantation master said, what some of the planters said. Well, one respectable Virginia planter boasted that boasted that his women were uncommonly good breeders and that he had never heard of babies coming as fast as they did on his plantation. Of course, the very gratifying thing about it was that every last one of them little pickaninnies was worth $200 the first time they took a breath. Here's one other planter. Georgian John C. Reed. His grandfather had advised him, John, get as many young breeding women as you can. Hide them out where they'll not be abused, and after a while, you can just collect them and have a big plantation of your own. The increase of your niggers will make you rich. Don't believe the numbers, believe the people. Now, these are white people who were there, these are black people who were there. Now, breeding definitely took place. In fact, the issue about whether it did or did not should be dead. Because see, what happened when people would argue over whether breeding did or did not take place, that meant they would not do any other research, because we're still arguing over the existence. No, let me tell you now, it did take place. Let's deal with the other part. Let's talk about whether it was profitable or not before I have to sit down. In 1858, the magazine Southern Cultivator published an article on the economics of breeding. One planter said, I own a woman who cost me $400 when she was a girl in 1827. Now, she didn't make me anything because she didn't work too hard, but she only cost me a little clothing and a few foodstuffs because she had to grow her own. But she now has 3 children. They are each worth over $3,000. I would not give or take even $700 for her. So already I have earned money. Her oldest son is worth $1,250 cash, and I can get it right now. John C. Randolph, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, out of the Virginia House of Delegates in January 1832, said that the exportation of slaves from Virginia to other southern states for the last 20 years has averaged 8,500. We should be ashamed of ourselves. I am an honorable patriot, but I know you are not going to give this up because it makes too much money. Over 20,000 slaves were in the domestic slave trade during the 19th century. Every year. That's the average. 20,000 slaves, even at a low cost, even if we lowballed it and talked about $1,200 instead of $1,500 or $1,800 or $2,500. If we lowballed it, that's $24 million every year. Let's talk about Virginia with its 9,000 slaves every year, surplus slaves. They call them all kind of names, okay? Extra, surplus, but they never call them what they were, okay? Virginia made over $11 million extra just because they sold surplus slaves. Now, you all remember, those of you who are smokers, those of you who have been dealing with the tobacco industry, tobacco kills the soil. After a while, you have to back off. You cannot keep growing tobacco every year in the same soil, you kill it, which is what they did. So in the upper South, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, they had to have something else going on. Cotton never was that big in those areas. Neither was indigo, neither was sugar cane. Everybody understands about the crops and the products and how they impact the treatment of slaves. So what they did was to come up with another way. We will make money by growing slaves, and we will grow them for sale and profit. Was there slave breeding? Yes. Was it profitable? Absolutely. What do we have to do now? Go back into the archives and find these forms. in terms of the reparations advocates, we have to prove what we are saying. You got to be able to say on John Randolph's farm, he had 300 slaves, he made this amount of money during this time period. Now what they will tell you, what most of the historians will tell you, that we've only found 47 or 50 of these, so there was nothing systematic. People didn't do it. Yes, they did, but they put it in other areas. They put it under livestock. They put it places that you would have to go and look for. Now they bragged about it on the one hand, but did not put it in the records where you would go look for it in the other hand. They don't have any books that say slave breeding records. Now, does anyone in here know any man that's going to come and give you a written record? Here are my conquests. Here are the women that I've been with. Now, if a woman can find that, you found a fool. No, they didn't do that. But the records are there. As a gentleman said, as a scholar said earlier this morning, old records, new questions, new conclusions. Can it be proven? Can it be tracked? Can it be specified? You're damn right. Not only will you have suits about insurance companies, no, we're going to get to the heart and soul of the matter. Because all the other issues will die on the vine. You let us prove that white people bred black people as if they were horses and dogs and cattle. You let us get back into the records and get these names. You talking about a reckoning being done? You don't even understand what this is about. And the historical records are there. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you, Professor Horn. Now we have Professor Christopher McCauley from the UC Santa Barbara.
Well, I have to start by saying that I don't know what I could possibly say to top that one. In fact, I'm not entirely sure what I can say to top much of what's been said during the course of this panel. However, I thought that one of the ways that I could try to tie together some of the things that have been said is to ask a general question, which is why it is that there's been such resistance to or silence about some of the issues that the panelists have raised, be it this relationship between the birth of the Republic and enslavement, be it this issue of slave breeding, the fact that it did go on, and in fact that there has been such serious attempts to actually hide it. And then thirdly, too, the work that Professor Unequal has been doing for a number of years, which has been looking at the role of enslavement and, of course, the expansion of markets for the commodities that slaves produced and what that actually did for the growth not only of England but of the larger Atlantic world. We can come back and ask why it is that these political, these social and economic linkages and multiplier effects have been consistently denied, particularly here in the United States. And I thought that, and Professor Dodson, if he's still here, will have to forgive me. Well, he left, so this is good, because some of this I already said at a conference recently in New York, and so I didn't want to repeat myself before anyone. But I thought, in thinking about these things, I feel that there perhaps are probably three main reasons as to why it is that there is such resistance or silence about certain issues. And the three reasons that I've come up with, one, very simply racism, and I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that in a second. Secondly, I would say that some of this resistance and silence has to do with the implications that it has for, I think, democratic theory, and also the influence of liberalism, because we like to think of ourselves as a liberal society. And thirdly, I think we're also dealing, particularly in the case of Professor Unequal's comments and his work, we're dealing with issues around what it implies for economic development theory. And let me just take these in turn. The racism to which I'm referring is not necessarily the racism of, of bigotry or even, say, prejudice for economic gain. I'm actually referring more to racism of this sort. I kind of have the impression, and people can tell me if they disagree with me in this way, but it's always been, or for a while now, it's been my feeling that had slavery in the Americas actually been a non-racial slavery, if it had been of the Mediterranean sort from, say, the era of Rome up until the mid-ages, that is sort of like an equal opportunity slavery in which we could have found a variety of types of people on the slave market. I imagine that now we would not have difficulty, given the composition of our society, we would probably not have difficulty discussing an issue like the slave breeding and its profitability. It seems to me that part of the resistance to certain issues around slavery in this country, I think, derive from the fact that we're dealing with what is a non-majority experience, what is really a non-white experience. I feel like had it been more of a white experience, or had it been actually a white experience, or in part in the Americas, then I think we would probably be, as a society, more able to discuss some of these issues such that they're not kind of considered actually non-mainstream. It seems to me that they would be considered very mainstream. So that's part of what it is that I feel makes discussing certain of the I mean, certainly discussions of slavery, but particularly the very cruel and very horrifying aspects of slavery that much more difficult, because we are talking about experiences that affected a minority population, as opposed to one that perhaps could have affected, as it did in the Mediterranean of earlier periods, a variety of peoples. Secondly, it seems pretty clear that one of the things that we have to consider in, I think, the Western political experience, because this is not something that we only see in this country, but we've certainly seen it in the modern era from about the period of the Dutch Revolution or the Dutch Revolt of the mid to late 16th and mid 17th century, all the way through to the French Revolution, that there seems to be this ability in the Western experience to actually define and expand citizenship at the same time that it's denied to increasing numbers of people within those borders or in overseas colonies. So one of the things that well, I mean, we can kind of ask this as a question of, is this a dilemma, is this a contradiction, or or is this simply something that is true to the longer Western experience? Because we also know too that in 5th century Greece, which some Westerners look to as the foundations of democratic society, democratic rule, that if I'm correct, we're talking about at least a third, if not more, of the Greek populace being an enslaved populace. So that at least if there's something consistent in what it is that we've seen, say, in the ancient Western experience and also in the early modern and modern experience, it seems to be this, this definition of the citizen at the same time that there's this definition of who is not going to be a citizen, and even worse, who is actually going to be enslaved or outcast. Secondly, too, I'd also say on the political front, and this is related to Professor Finkelman's remarks, as a society that likes to consider itself liberal, by which I mean that we think that there is individual equality before the law, at least we profess that there's also equality of opportunity for all, and that we have this, under a capitalist regime, we have this belief that by and large market mechanisms can resolve most social conflicts. We know that the experience of enslaved people, and even the experience of recently freed enslaved people flies in the face of liberal theory. So it seems to me that one of the reasons why it is that some people tend to be particularly resistant, apart from what it implies about democratic theory, another reason why it is that people are resistant to some of the political implications of enslavement has to do with enslavement does not essentially fit the liberal regime. Thirdly, and this is related to largely to Professor Nikori's, but to a lesser degree Professor Horn's statements, I think we've really got to, particularly when we're talking about the profitability of slavery and issues around what it is that slavery sort of catalyzed in the way of larger Western economic development. I think that those reasons alone, I think, are enough to kind of tell us why it is, or suggest why it is that some scholars, some lay people have been particularly resistant to giving slavery its due. I might just read from you something that some of you may know this Swiss economic historian, Paul Bachoch, and most recently he's written a book called Economic and Social History of the World, and he's a fairly well-known scholar, and this comes from some of his essays that University of Chicago Press printed, called Economics and World History, Myths and Paradoxes. But he said something in one of these essays that I thought was very interesting. And I'll just quote it, I'll read it here. He said, "If the exploitation of the Third World had been the main cause or even only a major factor in the Industrial Revolution and/or of the first century of the West's development, this would entail a very significant consequence. Indeed, if such had been the case, it would imply that economic development requires the exploitation of other larger regions to succeed, and since the Third World could not fulfill these conditions today, it implies the impossibility of its economic development. Therefore, it is very fortunate that the experience of the West shows that a process of economic development is possible without exploitation of other regions." Now, for many of us, I mean, talking about a lie, to paraphrase, to borrow Professor Horn's words, I mean, this to me is actually quite a blatant lie, but actually what makes it so particularly suggestive is that Professor Baroque is already telling us that one of the reasons why it is that he has to say the things that he is saying, or believe what it is that he has to believe, is because were he actually to say otherwise, well then it would make, in many ways, the domain of economic development theory obsolete. Because certain things, of course, that the West was able to do to non-European people cannot be repeated, or at least it can't be repeated at this juncture. Then the other question is too, would we want to repeat it? So I think that this speaks to, in fact, in part, why it is that there has been serious resistance to the work of the likes of Professor Unequal, and even why it is that there's been, resistance to even the work of, say, an Eric Williams or Walter Rodney and the like. And so, I know that you've been sitting here for a while. Those are going to be the remarks that I'm going to make, and I guess we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, we'll throw it up to the questions from folks in the audience. Feel free. The gentleman back here in the hat, did you? No? Anyone else? Professor Horn.
Yes, the question to Professor Unequal, although anyone who has might respond. In the current issue of the American Historical Review, there is one side of this debate that has erupted amongst historians. On one side of the debate is the work of David Landis, which is sort of, the so-called rise of the West, or, why we demand type of approach. That in a sense seeks to try to explain the, quote, ascendancy, unquote, of Western Europe and its progeny, such as the United States. And on the other side of the debate, you have this developing theses put forward by Gunder Frank and Reorient, and Kenneth Pomerantz and the Great Divergence, and Ben Wong, which tries to suggest that Landis is overstating the case, because actually they would argue that China was probably the leading economic power in the world up until about 1800. And then the question becomes, well, what happened? And in his introduction to this exchange, to these essays in the current issue of the American Historical Review, your colleague Patrick Manning suggests that one of the missing links is the question of Africa. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with this debate, and if so, would you like to speak to some of the issues raised?
Certainly, I'm familiar with that kind of literature. I think the book by Lund was published 1998, almost simultaneously with the one by Gude Frank. The problem with that kind of work is that it is so general that you can only really accept the arguments as a matter of faith. And that is why I resist participating in such very, very broad kinds of arguments. And I have had to really restrict myself to the kind of detailed empirical work that I can present. And if somebody disagrees with me, we can then debate the issues on the basis of the empirical evidence as well as the application of theory to evidence. Actually, if I may just take advantage of your question to make a point I wanted to make earlier that I didn't make. The paper that I'm presenting in this conference really is a summary, a painful summary of my book that is being published by Cambridge University Press. It's coming out in June, about 600 pages on exactly the same subject. So I have worked for about 3 decades now conducting the kind of research that I think will enable me to say the kind of things I'm saying. And if one disagrees with me, we can debate the issues on the basis of concrete evidence, as opposed to the kind of very broad and generalized statements about geography, about race, about culture, and all of that kind of thing that you will find in David Lund's. Of course, you do have the counterpart of that kind of argument also were coming from the other side. A gentleman that I think you may want to mention is part of the University of California complex, Kenneth Pomeranz, who has now worked on the Asian side, worked with the evidence relating to China. All of the arguments that people have developed about the uniqueness, either in terms of culture or in terms of all sorts of things that can explain the Western development, he comes up with fairly persuasive kind of evidence showing that much of what is being presented as a unique to Western Europe, in fact, was also there in China. And that up to 1750, China really was developing on equal pace with the Western world, particularly Europe. And that's really what made all of the difference. The point at which the Western Europe began to move away from China was at the time when Western Europe started exploiting the resources of the Americas, and actually develops an argument that very much complements the one I'm developing, except that it doesn't emphasize the issue of market demand. Rather, he bases his argument on what he describes as ecological constraint, which is okay. People can always choose what they want to emphasize. So if I may finally make my point about your argument, I really don't have too much faith in broad general arguments that you can only accept on the basis of faith.
Any other takers up here?
No, that's enough.
Okay, let's see. How about quickly over here to my right? Yes, you. Yeah, you. Wait, he's got a microphone.
Well, let me put it this way. It seems to me that the crux of this issue, even though slavery was a phenomenon of the Atlantic world, the crux of the issue is the United States. That is, it's precisely here that we get all this obscuring and hiding, and I didn't know anything about it, and so forth. In other parts of the Americas where you had slavery, everybody knows about it. You can talk about it on the street. You can talk about over here. They got languages for it. They know all about it. Doesn't mean they are doing nice things about it, but at least they are not acting like they never heard of it. So we have to ask some specific questions about this kind of place called the United States, because it's a weird place. Because most of the people here who are supposedly legitimated came from somewhere else. That is, it's a displaced population. The people who were enslaved here came from somewhere else. The people who enslaved them came from somewhere else. And then the people who were already here were in various ways delegitimated, displaced, et cetera, et cetera. That leaves a certain kind of funny vacuum as it relates to language. How do you talk in a place which is not yours? What do you say? What do you do? How do you claim a land which is not yours? And I think this has a great deal to do with the disjunction between actions and language that is rampant through American culture. It's very difficult to talk about the present in a true sense. So we always are talking about a future, that we refuse to have a present. And it struck me, both the panel this morning and this one, we need a new language. In Professor Unequal's paper, it struck me that Europe is just, this thing we're calling Europe, it's a funny thing, once you look at it from the Atlantic world as over against the Mediterranean world. So we're talking about maybe two Europes here. It's not just that wonderful continuity that they teach you in the history of Western Civ. There's another Europe being made here out of the Atlantic. And where did we come from? The Professor Horn, he's telling us, well, we didn't come from Africa. Most of us, we came from right here. And you might say, yeah, we know there was some of us were born here, but we didn't know they had a factory doing it, and there was money in it. So we need a new language if we're going to deal with slavery. And that new language can only come out of conferences like this, where issues are presented in such a way that forces us to find ways of really talking about what happened in this place.
I'd like to answer the first part of your question. I have no notion of what the new language would be.
I don't either.
But I have a few thoughts about what the difference between the United States and other Western Hemisphere countries would be. It strikes me that there are at minimum 4 very different aspects of the U.S. and most of the rest of the New World. First of all, in the United States, slavery is geographically isolated to one very specific part of the country. And actually there are 5. So the first is that. So that when one talks, for example, about the problem of slavery in Hispaniola, which later becomes Haiti and the Dominican Republic, slavery is everywhere. Cubans can't say, well, slavery was just in North Cuba. So that slavery is geographically national, whereas in the United States it's geographically local. Secondly, in the United States, unlike most of the New World slave societies, the slaves are a minority of the population, whereas in many of the other places, slaves are the majority, so that when one goes to the Caribbean, or Brazil, which, by the way, is the largest African origin country in the world. There are more Afro-Brazilians than there are Nigerians. Brazil is an African country, and everybody shares this. And of course, as one of the speakers talked about earlier, the Brazilians are not as obsessed about racial purity and other kind of neo-Nazi concepts that float around the United States so much. So that the minority status is very real here, in the sense that the majority population was not slaves. Secondly, there is vast post-slavery immigration to the United States. Now, that's also true in Brazil. It's true in Argentina, but that wasn't a great slave center. It's not true for most of the Caribbean. So there is a huge population of people in the United States whose ancestors, in fact, had no connection whatsoever with slavery and who are therefore disconnected from it in a couple of ways. One of them, of course, goes to the issue which keeps popping up however much we want to slam the lid on it of reparations. Many people of many Americans would say, well, I had nothing to do with that. My family was in X. And by now it's all over the world. My family was in Africa, my family was in Asia, my family was in Europe, my family was somewhere else. We weren't here, therefore we're not responsible for these past harms. You can't say that in, say, Cuba, where there's very little post-emancipation migration. The racialization of slavery is greater in the U.S. than anywhere else. That's the fourth point, that we really are, we're obsessed with race in ways that few countries are. Finally, there's the method that we ended slavery. That is, this is the only place I know of in the world where you ended slavery by a civil war in which the non-slaveholders made war against the slaveholders, or in which the slaveholders, depending upon how you believe the war began, and I think it would be the way I'm going to describe it now, the slaveholders made war against the non-slaveholders. The United States is the only place where the slave revolt is by the slave owners, not by the slaves. And so because of that, there is this tremendous trauma that particularly Southern whites have to come to terms with, that they have never come to terms with, one of which is they started a war and lost. You don't have that in other countries. In Brazil, emancipation is a national process that's done peacefully through elections. I can't answer the rest of your question, but at least I think this sets out some of the really striking differences why United States slavery, see, I've already learned something from Douglas today, United States slavery is different from other kinds of American slavery.
Anybody else?
Yeah, let me, very, very quickly, let me see if I can do a sound bite. Afrocentricity, at its best, promises and offers a new voice, new questions, and essentially a new analytical language. Reparations is going to be the coming of age of that new language.
Just a very brief comment on Charles. I think you're pointing to something that is quite significant. A major problem in understanding the role of African slavery in the Americas in the development of the current global economic system, a major stumbling block is conceptual, that for one to really be able to deal with this, not only do you need some command of economic analysis, but some command of economic analysis of a specific type, development economics. And in the United States, to the best of my knowledge, this is a branch of the science of economics that is not really very much promoted. And so you don't really have, even within the educated community, you don't really have a large population that is really able to deal with the economics of the subject. We've done very well in the area of culture. A lot of very good books have been written in terms of the cultural developments associated with slavery. But when you move from there to the economics of the subject, the problem begins. And one of the reasons why sometimes I run into trouble in my presentations during conferences, maybe I'm really too conscious of what this problem is, that I try always believing that what I'm going to say is probably going to be the only thing my audience is going to hear from me. They're not likely to read my books or my publications. I try as hard as I can to make the argument plain enough, but quite often I get lost in terms of struggling with time.
Okay, we have time for perhaps 2 more questions. Let us see. Wait, let's get the young man. Wait a minute, young man with the blue shirt back here. He had a question a long time ago, and then we'll get to. And then where's the other person that had a question? Okay, right. Oh.
The young man.
Okay, let's. All right, since everybody's pointing at this gentleman, is that a maroon shirt? Okay, he's got the microphone anyway.
Thank you. This question is for Professor Horn. Apart from the time constraint that you had to deal with, I know that when you spend long years, long time reflecting on a subject and making it your own, there's a tendency to assume that the shorthand that you employ, everyone's on that page with you. I have to plead a large ignorance, and I don't want to leave here, go away, assuming that I understand the implicit meaning of your statement. And this really is a question to ask you to bear with us and explain what you meant when you said that if we were to nail down the proof and to come up with the empirical verification of actual slave breeding, this would put the whole question of claimancy on a different level, and that I think you suggested we ain't seen anything yet. I'm not clear what you were getting at. What would be the differential that one could legally claim? If you know it, then I think you're kind of obliged to share it with us. What would be the differential, and what would its effect be?
And again, dealing with time constraints, let me see, can I do this quickly? Governments in America, federal, state, county, district, individuals, railroads, companies sanctioned and supported lynching in America. We know about the postcards, we know about, that being a part of this country. Reparations are due for that. We can take that to court, prove that. Property that African Americans owned, they bought. We're not talking about 40 acres and a mule. We're not talking about anybody giving you anything. We're talking about land, that we purchased Jefferson Davis's estate, for example, and we had that taken away legally. A judge took it away and gave it to somebody who had no real claim to it. The AP did a masterful study recently of all this land that African Americans had that they no longer have. We own more land, more real estate in the 1900s than we do in 2002. So when people start talking about how much better things are, the $599 billion that we spend, we don't really have any wealth that we can give over to people, because wealth is in private property and in real estate, that kind of thing. Again, you can prove that. Reparations do. We could do the same thing about slave insurance, et cetera, et cetera. However, reparations gets at the heart and soul of what we are about as a country. It's about justice, it's about respect, it's about the healing of this country. And we have mastered the art of deception and denial. To put the perpetrators face to face with not just torture, rape, murder, lynching, that kind of stuff. Fine, everybody did that one way or another. Everybody bombed, Oklahoma, bombed Tulsa when they got mad. We did Rosewood. So fine, that's over and done with. But when you put people face to face with, you systematically treated a group of human beings in the very same category that you treated a pig, dog, cat, and you did this for profit. You systematically bred people like they're going to clone people now. You systematically did this. Nobody else, including Hitler at his worst, nobody else has done this. America would go from middle, maybe toward the bottom, as a lot of people like to say, to the very top in the world of being the most vile, inhuman people alive. Nobody else has done this. That's what we're talking about.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom after a while. And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.